The act of mercy by a broke cowboy brought 300 Apaches to his door. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin our story. In the rugged heart of the American West, where the land stretched endlessly under a scorching sun, there lived a cowboy by the name of Luke Harris. He wasn't rich by any means, nor did he own the sprawling ranches that many of his neighbors boasted. His ranch was small, weathered by years of drought and hard labor. But Luke had something that could never be measured by money: a kind heart. Luke lived a solitary life on the outskirts of the frontier town of Sundown Ridge. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and he spent most of his days working the land and tending to his livestock. The quiet, simple life suited him. There was something peaceful about the endless horizon, but also something lonely. One warm afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Luke was out tending to his cattle near the river when he spotted something unusual. A man, or rather, a figure, limped down the dusty trail leading toward his property. The man was wearing the tattered remnants of what had once been fine clothes, now stained with dirt and blood. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one a struggle. Luke paused for a moment, watching the man's approach. He could see the desperation in his eyes and the weariness in his movements. The man was in need, and it was clear that he wasn't going to make it far on his own. Without hesitation, Luke walked toward him, offering what little assistance he could. "You look like you've seen better days," Luke said, his voice calm and kind. The man looked up at him, confusion and gratitude mixing in his eyes. "I've been walking for days. I don't know how much longer I can go," the stranger murmured. Luke gently guided him toward the small cabin where he lived. He gave him water and some bread, making sure the man was comfortable before going to work on his injuries. After a few hours, the man was asleep, resting in a spare bed. Luke knew he had done what was right. He didn't ask for any thanks, nor did he expect anything in return. He simply did what anyone would do for a fellow human being in need. But what Luke didn't know was that his simple act of kindness would soon lead to something far greater than he could have ever imagined. As the days passed, Luke continued with his routine, working the land and keeping to himself. The stranger, whom Luke learned was named Eli, had stayed with him for a few days, recovering from his wounds. Eli was a quiet man, reserved, yet there was something in his eyes that spoke of a past full of pain. Luke didn't ask about it. He knew that everyone had their own stories, their own burdens to carry. Eli didn't seem like the type to share his, and that was fine. But one morning, as Luke was finishing his chores near the barn, he heard the sound of hooves approaching. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but the sound grew louder, closer. He stood up, wiping his hands on his worn jeans, and looked toward the horizon. In the distance, he saw a small group of riders, their figures outlined against the bright blue sky. It was too early for anyone to be passing through. As the riders came into view, Luke's heart skipped a beat. They were Apache. The men were dressed in traditional clothing, their faces painted with the distinctive markings of their tribe. They rode with purpose, their movements coordinated and disciplined. Luke's first thought was that something had gone terribly wrong. He had helped one of their own, a stranger who had appeared at his doorstep. But what if that act had brought danger instead of gratitude? What if they were here to punish him for helping one of their people? His mind raced with these thoughts, but before he could make any decision, the Apache riders stopped just short of his cabin. They didn't speak. They simply waited, their eyes scanning the area. Luke's pulse quickened, his hands instinctively moving to the rifle he kept by the door. He had no desire for conflict, but he wasn't about to let them intimidate him without a fight. Then, from the center of the group, a tall man dismounted. He walked toward Luke, his gaze steady and unwavering. The man's face was weathered, his features strong, yet there was a calmness in his demeanor that set Luke at ease, just slightly. "We've come for him," the man said, his voice deep and commanding. Luke's confusion grew. "For who?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man nodded toward the cabin where Eli was resting. "The one you helped," the Apache leader said. "He is of our tribe." Luke's heart raced again, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from confusion and a strange sense of unease. He had no idea that the man he had helped was more than just a lost traveler. "I didn't know," Luke said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know who he was." The Apache leader studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, but then he seemed to relax. "It matters not," the man said. "What matters is the kindness you have shown, the life you saved." Luke stood there, unsure of what to say. He had acted out of instinct, out of simple compassion, but he had no idea it would lead to this. "I did what anyone would do," Luke said, shrugging. The Apache leader smiled faintly. "Not everyone would do what you did. You saved him when no one else would. That has value." Luke swallowed hard, still processing the events unfolding before him. Just then, Eli appeared in the doorway of the cabin, his face pale but determined. He stepped forward, meeting the leader's gaze. "You are here for me, aren't you?" Eli said, his voice steady despite the weakness in his body. The leader nodded, his expression softening. "Yes," he said simply. "You have been saved, and now it is time to repay that kindness." Eli looked back at Luke, his eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something Luke couldn't quite place. The leader spoke again. "We are here to offer you a gift, Luke Harris, the one who helped our brother in need. The gift of protection, the gift of honor." Luke blinked, unsure of what that meant. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice quiet. The Apache leader stepped closer. "The life you saved has meaning, and we do not forget those who show mercy." As Luke stood there, trying to make sense of everything, the weight of the Apache leader's words began to settle in. His simple act of kindness had triggered something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. Eli's past was tied to this tribe, and in saving him, Luke had unknowingly stepped into a world where mercy was revered and honored. He had no idea what would come next, but one thing was clear. This moment, this one small act of kindness, would change the course of his life forever. As the days passed, Luke found himself struggling to process everything that had unfolded since he had helped Eli. He had never intended for his simple act of mercy to lead to this. The Apache warriors had been kind, yet there was something unsettling about the entire situation. The leader's words echoed in his mind. "The life you saved has meaning." Luke wasn't sure what that meant for him, but one thing was clear. His life had just become far more complicated. Eli had spent the next few days recovering, staying inside the cabin to regain his strength. Luke kept his distance, not wanting to overstep, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Eli was hiding something. It wasn't just the quiet, reserved nature of the man. It was the way he carried himself, like a person who had seen things that no one should ever have to see. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Luke sat outside, staring at the flickering campfire in front of him. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought the Apache warriors to his doorstep. What was Eli's connection to them? And what exactly did they mean by honor and protection? His thoughts were interrupted when Eli walked out of the cabin, a somber look on his face. He walked toward the fire, sitting down beside Luke in silence. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the quiet evening. Finally, Eli broke the silence. "You must be wondering why they came," he said, his voice low and steady. Luke nodded. "I don't understand it. I helped you because it was the right thing to do. But I don't know what this has to do with Apache, warriors, or protection." Eli took a deep breath, his eyes flickering with something Luke couldn't quite place. "The Apache people value loyalty above all else," Eli began. "When someone shows kindness to one of us, we repay that kindness tenfold. It's the way of our people. And as for me, I'm not just any Apache. I am the son of the tribe's former leader." Luke's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected there was more to Eli's story than he had let on, but this was something entirely different. "You're the son of a chief?" Luke asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and awe. Eli nodded slowly. "I was forced to leave my people when I was young, after a series of violent conflicts with settlers. My father, the chief, was killed in one of those battles. I've been wandering ever since, trying to find my place in the world." Luke stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. The man who had shown up at his doorstep, injured and in need of help, wasn't just any traveler. He was royalty among the Apache, a leader's son. "So, when they came to thank me, it wasn't just for saving your life," Luke said, more to himself than to Eli. "No," Eli replied, his voice soft but firm. "It's more than that. The Apache people don't forget. When you help one of us, you become part of our world. And I owe you more than I can ever repay. Luke felt a wave of emotions flood through him. He had never expected anything in return for his actions, yet here he was, caught in the middle of something much bigger than himself. What does that mean for me? Luke asked, his voice thick with uncertainty. Eli looked at him, his eyes steady and unwavering. It means that the Apache will protect you, Luke Harris. You showed mercy when it was least expected, and now you are part of our tribe. No harm will come to you, not while we are here. Luke's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of Eli's words hung heavy in the air. You don't owe me anything, Luke said, his voice firm despite the shock he felt. I did what anyone would do. Eli smiled faintly, the first true smile Luke had seen from him. Maybe, but not everyone does. And that is why you have earned our protection. As the days turned into weeks, Luke began to realize that his life was no longer his own. The Apache warriors weren't just keeping watch over him. They had become a part of his life, his world. Wherever he went, they followed, a silent presence that he could feel but never fully understand. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he had made a choice when he helped Eli. A choice that would forever change the course of his life and the life of everyone around him. As weeks passed, Luke's life slowly shifted in ways he had never anticipated. The Apache warriors, though silent, had become an ever-present part of his world. They didn't interfere with his day-to-day work, but stayed close, guarding his land and ensuring his safety. It was a strange feeling, having so many people watching over him, but it was also a comforting one. Eli, the son of the Apache chief, remained at the cabin, recovering more each day. The bond between them had grown, even though words were still few between them. Luke knew Eli was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with purpose. Luke had begun to see him not just as a stranger in need of help, but as a brother in arms, bound by a shared act of mercy. One afternoon, Luke and Eli were sitting outside, watching the sun dip below the mountains, casting long shadows over the land. The evening was calm, with only the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. Luke was sharpening his knife when Eli broke the silence. There are things you don't know about the Apache, Eli said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of knowledge. Luke looked up, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean? He asked, setting his knife down. Eli paused, his gaze distant as though recalling memories that were both painful and precious. The Apache are not just warriors. We are a people of tradition, of honor, and of deep ties to the land. We do not give our word lightly, and we do not forget those who have shown us kindness. Luke nodded, understanding more than he could say. He had seen that in the way the Apache respected each other and the land they called home. But there was more. And what? Of me? Luke asked, his voice steady despite the weight of the question. What does my kindness mean to your people? Eli turned to him, his dark eyes meeting Luke's with a look of quiet intensity. It means you are bound to us now. You may not have asked for it, but you are a part of our tribe. Your land, your home, it is safe under our protection. And when the time comes, you will be called upon to stand with us. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Luke didn't know what to say. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had simply done what felt right. But now, his life was entwined with the fate of the Apache, and there was no turning back. As the sun set, casting a soft golden glow over the landscape, Luke felt the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had saved a man's life, and now that man's people were offering him protection, loyalty, and honor. The bond was unspoken but unbreakable. The next few days brought new challenges. Though the Apache warriors had made it clear that they were there to protect Luke, not everyone in the nearby town of Sundown Ridge was as understanding. Word had spread about the Apache's presence, and soon, rumors began to swirl. Some people in town were fearful, others were angry, and a few were downright hostile. It wasn't long before Luke began to hear whispers of men who planned to take matters into their own hands. One evening, as he was walking back from the barn, Luke saw a group of men standing near the edge of his property. They weren't the usual faces from town. These men looked rough, like they had come for trouble. Luke's heart sank as he recognized one of them, a man named Clark who had never liked him much. Clark had always thought Luke was too soft, too kind for a man in the frontier. Now, it seemed, he had come to prove a point. Luke stopped in his tracks, sizing up the situation. He wasn't armed, but his presence alone seemed to be enough to keep the men from advancing. Clark stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "You think you're safe, don't you, Harris?" he spat. "Think you've got a tribe of savages watching your back?" Luke's eyes narrowed. "I think I've done what's right. And I think I'm not afraid of men like you." Clark laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "You're nothing but a fool. Those Apache will turn on you the first chance they get. They're no better than the animals they live with." Luke didn't flinch, though his heart raced. He could feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke. But before he could respond, a figure appeared behind the group of men, stepping out of the shadows. It was Eli. His presence alone was enough to stop the men in their tracks. "You're on my land now," Eli said, his voice calm but full of authority. The men turned to face him, their expressions faltering. "And if you mean to threaten Luke Harris, you'll have to go through me." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. Clark hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously between Luke and Eli. The Apache warrior was not one to be trifled with, and Clark knew it. Slowly, the group of men backed off, murmuring to each other as they retreated. Eli stood there for a moment, watching them go, before turning back to Luke. "The Apache protect their own," he said simply. Luke watched the men retreat, his heart still pounding. It had been a close call, but the Apache had made it clear they were true to their word. And for the first time since all of this began, Luke felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of peace. He wasn't alone anymore. He was part of something much bigger than himself. Days turned into weeks, and Luke's life began to settle into a new rhythm. With the Apache warriors still keeping a watchful eye over him, life felt both familiar and completely transformed. There was an unease in the air, an unspoken tension, as though something was about to shift again. Eli had fully recovered, though he still carried the weight of his past on his shoulders. He spent his time helping Luke with the ranch, but there was always a quietness about him, a distance that Luke couldn't fully understand. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Eli spoke up, breaking the comfortable silence. "There's a reason I never went back to my people," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. In the crackling of the fire, Luke looked up, surprised by the sudden shift in the conversation. "What do you mean?" Eli didn't look at him, his gaze fixed on the flames. "After my father died, I was left to lead the tribe. But I wasn't ready. I didn't have the strength, the wisdom." Eli continued, his words heavy with regret. "I made mistakes. I let others take control of the tribe, and in doing so, I lost everything. My place, my people, my pride." Luke could sense the pain in Eli's words, the regret that seemed to haunt him. He had never seen Eli speak so openly about his past, and it stirred something in Luke, a deep sense of understanding. "You've had to carry all of that on your own, haven't you?" Luke said, his voice soft. Eli nodded, his jaw tight. "I've been running from my past for so long, trying to find a place where I could start over. But I never felt like I belonged anywhere. Until now." Luke paused, considering his words carefully. "You don't have to do it alone anymore, Eli. You've got a place here, with me, with us." Eli's eyes met Luke's, and for the first time, Luke saw a flicker of something like hope in them. The kind of hope that comes from knowing you're no longer alone in the world. The next morning, the uneasy feeling that had been lingering in the air finally made sense. A group of settlers had arrived in town, and with them came trouble. Word had spread about the Apache warriors being near Luke's land, and some of the more aggressive men in town had begun to stir up hostility. Luke could feel the tension building as more settlers gathered, some with weapons, others with harsh words. He knew it was only a matter of time before things would escalate. As Luke was out near the barn, preparing for the day, he heard the familiar sound of hooves approaching. He looked up, expecting to see the Apache warriors, but instead, he saw a group of men riding fast toward him. They were not Apache. They were settlers, and they looked angry. Luke's heart sank as they stopped just short of his property. At the front of the group was a man Luke had seen before, a local rancher named Frank who had never been fond of Luke's solitary ways. Frank stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You've been harboring those Apache savages, haven't you, Harris?" he shouted, his voice carrying across the land. Luke's stomach tightened, but he stood his ground. "I've done nothing wrong, Frank." "They've done nothing wrong either." Frank's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, his hand hovering over his gun. You're a fool, Harris. You think you can befriend them, but they'll turn on you the first chance they get. Mark my words, they're dangerous. Luke's eyes flicked over to Eli, who had appeared in the doorway of the cabin. He could see the tension in Eli's posture, the way he stood, ready to protect, ready to face whatever came their way. Frank saw Eli, and his expression faltered for just a moment. But then he straightened, trying to regain his composure. You're nothing but a traitor, Harris, Frank spat. You're siding with those savages, and I won't stand for it. The group of men behind Frank murmured in agreement, the atmosphere growing more hostile by the second. Luke's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. I don't need to side with anyone, Frank. I just want to live my life in peace. Frank scoffed. Peace? You think you can have peace with them? You're fooling yourself. Before Luke could respond, Eli stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. We don't seek violence, Eli said, his voice calm but firm. But we will not stand by while you threaten the lives of those under our protection. The settlers looked taken aback by Eli's words, unsure of how to respond. The tension was thick, but Eli's quiet confidence seemed to shift the balance of power. Frank glared at Eli, but he didn't make a move. Instead, he glanced at the other men in his group, and they began to back away. Frank turned his eyes back to Luke. You've got a lot of nerve, Harris. But mark my words, this won't end here. You've made a dangerous choice, and one day, you'll regret it. With that, Frank and his men rode off, leaving Luke standing in the silence that followed. The threat was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Luke felt a sense of resolve. He wasn't alone. Eli was with him, and so were the Apache warriors. Together, they would face whatever came their way, and they would not back down. The next few days were filled with an uneasy calm. The settlers had left, but their threat still loomed over Luke and Eli. The Apache warriors, who had been keeping their distance, now gathered more closely around the property, sensing that trouble was brewing. Luke knew this wasn't over. It wasn't just the settlers. They were just one part of the bigger picture. The conflict between the settlers and the Apache had been ongoing for years, and Luke had unknowingly stepped into the middle of it. As the days stretched on, Luke found himself growing more and more aware of the world around him. His small ranch, which had once felt like a peaceful sanctuary, now seemed like the epicenter of a much larger struggle. Eli, though quieter than usual, was more present than ever. He stayed close by, always ready to stand between Luke and any danger that came their way. But Luke knew that the time for peace was running out. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Luke sat outside the cabin, watching the orange glow of the horizon. He heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Eli walking toward him. The expression on his face was serious, more serious than Luke had seen it before. We need to talk, Eli said, his voice steady but urgent. Luke stood up, sensing the weight of the conversation. What's going on? Eli paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon, as if he were waiting for something. Then, he spoke, his words heavy with meaning. The settlers will come again. But this time, it won't just be them. Word is spreading about the Apache's presence, and soon, the cavalry will come. Luke's heart sank at the mention of the cavalry. He had heard stories of how the military had dealt with the Apache in the past, stories that sent chills down his spine. How soon? Luke asked, trying to steady his voice. Eli's eyes hardened. Soon enough. The settlers won't stop until they've driven us out. And the cavalry will be their weapon. We have to be ready. Luke felt the weight of Eli's words settle deep in his chest. He had never imagined his life would come to this, fighting not only for his land, but for the very life of his new friend, and for the Apache people he had come to care for. The next few days were filled with preparation. Eli, with his knowledge of the land, worked with the Apache warriors to create hidden paths and strategic positions around the ranch. They moved quickly, quietly, ensuring that they would be ready when the time came. Luke helped where he could, though he was often left to watch as the Apache warriors carried out their plans. He had learned much from them in the past few weeks, about survival, about respect for the land, and about honor. But even as he prepared, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that this was a battle he couldn't win alone. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, Luke and Eli stood together near the edge of the property, looking out over the land. The peaceful silence was broken by the distant sound of hooves. Luke's heart skipped a beat. They're coming, Eli said quietly. Luke nodded, his hand instinctively going to the rifle he had taken from the cabin. The cavalry was approaching. Luke could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a fight for his home. It was a fight for the Apache, for their way of life, for everything they had fought for. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Luke took a deep breath and turned to Eli. "We stand together," Luke said, his voice firm. Eli met his gaze, and for a moment, there was no need for words. They had both made their choice. They would fight, not just for the land, but for each other, for what was right. The cavalry soon came into view, riding toward them in a formation that was tight, controlled. Luke's heart raced, but he didn't back down. This was it. The moment had arrived. But as the soldiers neared, something unexpected happened. The Apache warriors, hidden in the shadows, made their presence known, stepping out in a silent wave. The tension in the air was palpable as the soldiers pulled their horses to a stop, their eyes wide at the sight before them. The Apache warriors didn't speak, didn't make a move. They simply stood there, unwavering, a wall of silent strength. The leader of the cavalry dismounted, his eyes scanning the warriors before turning to Luke and Eli. "This land is under the protection of the U.S. government," the officer said, his voice commanding. Eli stepped forward, his gaze steady and unflinching. "This land belongs to those who protect it, and we protect it." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. Behind him, the soldiers stood tense, waiting for orders. Luke could feel the weight of the moment, the choice before them. The officer looked between the Apache and Luke, the realization dawning on him. He had expected a fight, a battle, but instead, he saw something else, something that made him hesitate. "You have no business here," Eli continued, his voice cold but firm. The officer's eyes flicked to the soldiers, and after a long moment, he gave a small nod. "We'll be gone by morning," he said, and with that, he signaled to his men. As quickly as they had come, the cavalry turned and rode away, leaving Luke and Eli standing together on the land that had been saved. Luke exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The Apache had won. For now, they had claimed victory. But Luke knew the war was far from over. The tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But in that moment, standing side by side with Eli, Luke felt a surge of hope. They had fought, and they had won. And that was enough for now. The morning after the cavalry left, the air around Luke's ranch felt different. It was a subtle change, like the calm that follows a storm, yet the tension still hung in the air, just beneath the surface. The Apache warriors were more visible now, their presence a reminder of what had been gained and what was still at risk. Luke stood by the barn, looking over the land, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. Eli stood beside him, just as silent, but there was a sense of pride in his posture, a quiet confidence that Luke hadn't seen before. For the first time in a long while, Luke felt like the danger was behind them, at least for now. But there was a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling that peace, if it had come at all, was temporary. "We've won this round, Eli," Luke said quietly, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the moment. "But I don't think it's over." "Not yet." Eli nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for any sign of the next threat. "No," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's not over. But we've made a stand. We've shown them that we won't back down." Luke let out a deep breath, feeling the tension in his chest loosen just a little. "You're right. But I can't help but wonder what will come next." Eli turned to face him, his expression serious. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. You've shown more than enough heart to stand by us, Luke. And that's something we don't forget." Luke met Eli's gaze, a sense of solidarity filling him. He had stepped into a world he never expected, but in that moment, he felt more certain of his place than ever before. The day passed slowly, and as the sun began to set, a figure appeared on the horizon, riding alone. Luke's hand instinctively went to the rifle at his side, but Eli held up a hand, signaling him to stay calm. The figure drew closer, and soon, Luke could make out the shape of a man on horseback. It wasn't a settler, and it wasn't a soldier. It was someone he hadn't seen before, a man dressed in the traditional clothing of the Apache. He rode with purpose, his gaze fixed on the ranch. As the man approached, Eli stepped forward, his movements deliberate. "Who are you?" Eli called out, his voice carrying across the distance. The man slowed his horse, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. "I am Taya, the man said, his voice steady but low. "I come to speak with the one who saved our brother." Luke's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected the Apache to be so open about their gratitude, but here it was, another sign that the world around him had changed. "Saved your brother?" Luke asked, stepping forward cautiously. The man nodded, his gaze never leaving Eli. "Yes," Tejas said. "You have earned our respect, Luke Harris. And we offer you something in return." Luke exchanged a glance with Eli, both of them unsure of what this man meant. "What do you offer?" Eli asked, his voice cautious but respectful. Tejas dismounted, his movements deliberate and slow. "We offer you our alliance," Tejas said, his voice firm. "You have proven that you are more than just an outsider. You have earned a place among us. And in return, we will offer you our protection, our loyalty." Luke felt a sense of disbelief settle over him. He had never imagined that his simple act of mercy would lead to something so significant. "But I'm not one of you," Luke said, his voice quiet but filled with uncertainty. "I don't belong to your people." Tejas looked at him, his eyes steady and unwavering. "You do now," he said simply. "You stood by one of us when it mattered. And now, you stand by all of us." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Luke didn't know how to respond. He had never expected to be drawn into a world so far removed from the one he had known. But here he was, caught between two worlds, and no matter how much he tried to push it away, he couldn't deny the truth of Tejas' words. Eli stepped forward, placing a hand on Luke's shoulder. "This is our way," Eli said, his voice low. "And now it's your way too." Luke nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something that transcended bloodlines and boundaries. He had chosen this path, whether he knew it or not. "I don't know what to say," Luke said, his voice thick with emotion. Tejas smiled faintly, the first hint of warmth in his expression. "You don't have to say anything, Luke Harris. You've already said it by your actions." With that, Tejas turned and mounted his horse, signaling for his riders to follow. "We'll see you again soon," he said over his shoulder. "And when we do, we will stand as one." As Tejas and his men rode off into the sunset, Luke stood there, his heart heavy with the realization that his life had changed forever. He wasn't just a man living alone on a ranch anymore. He was part of something far bigger, something that had the power to shape his destiny. And no matter what came next, he knew that he would face it with the Apache by his side. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy calm. Luke found himself adapting to his new reality, no longer just a rancher in the quiet wilderness, but now part of a much larger world. The Apache had made it clear that they would protect him, and Luke felt a sense of responsibility for their trust in him. Yet, there was still a part of him that felt like an outsider, unsure of his place in a world so different from the one he had known. But with each passing day, the bond between him and Eli deepened. The two men worked side by side, tending to the land, repairing fences, and keeping watch over the ranch. Luke had learned much from Eli, not just about surviving in the harsh wilderness, but about the Apache way of life, honor, loyalty, and respect for the land. But despite the peace that had settled over the ranch, the threat was never far. Luke could feel it, a tension in the air that never quite left. The settlers in town had not forgotten about the Apache, and Luke knew it was only a matter of time before the situation would escalate once again. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Eli pulled Luke aside. The wind had picked up, and the air was heavy with the scent of rain. Eli's expression was grim, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. "Something's coming," he said quietly. Luke looked around, but he saw nothing out of the ordinary. The land stretched out in front of him, quiet and still. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I don't know," Eli replied, his voice low. "But I can feel it. There's something out there, something we're not ready for." Luke nodded, a sense of unease settling over him. He had learned to trust Eli's instincts, and if Eli was concerned, then there was reason to be. They spent the rest of the evening preparing, checking the perimeter of the ranch, and ensuring the weapons were within reach. By the time the sun had set, the tension in the air was thick. They huddled around the fire, neither of them speaking, the crackling of the flames the only sound in the stillness. The night passed uneventfully, but Luke couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It wasn't until the following afternoon that Luke understood what Eli had been sensing. He was out near the barn when he heard the distant sound of hooves. It was a low rumble at first, but it quickly grew louder, closer. Luke's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for his rifle, his fingers gripping the cold metal. Eli appeared from behind the cabin, his face serious, his eyes scanning the distance. "They're here," he said quietly. Luke's grip on the rifle tightened. He didn't know who was coming, but he could feel the weight of the moment. The Apache had warned him that the settlers and the cavalry would return, but he hadn't expected it so soon. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Luke could now see a group of men riding toward him, their figures growing clearer as they drew closer. These men weren't settlers, nor were they cavalry. They were Apache warriors, riders who carried themselves with the discipline and precision of a well-trained army. The leader of the group rode ahead of the others, his face marked with the symbols of his tribe. As he drew closer, Luke's heart began to pound in his chest. The man stopped just short of the ranch, his horse's hooves kicking up dust as he dismounted. He looked at Luke with steady eyes, his expression unreadable. "We have come," the man said, his voice deep and calm. Luke's confusion deepened. "Come for what?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man looked at Eli, his gaze softening. "To make a choice." Eli stepped forward, his face calm, but Luke could see the tension in his body. "What choice?" Eli asked. The Apache warrior's gaze shifted back to Luke, then to the land around them. "The time has come to decide," the man said. "The Apache are no longer just a tribe. We are a people without a home, scattered across the land. But we have found something here, something that we can protect." Luke's heart raced as the weight of the warrior's words hit him. The Apache weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting for survival, for a place where they could exist without fear. The warrior continued. "You have shown us mercy, and you have shown us strength. Now, we ask you to make a choice. Will you stand with us, Luke Harris? Will you protect this land, this place, with us?" Luke felt the weight of the question settle deep in his chest. He had already made a choice when he helped Eli, when he welcomed the Apache into his life. But this was different. This was no longer just about survival. It was about something bigger, something that transcended the boundaries of race, of history, of everything that had come before. Eli stood silently beside him, his expression unreadable. Luke looked around at the land he had come to love, the rolling hills, the wide open sky, and he knew, deep in his heart, that this was his home. The Apache had saved him, and now it was his turn to stand by them. "I'll stand with you," Luke said, his voice steady and firm. The warrior nodded, as if he had known Luke's answer all along. "Then we are united," he said, his voice filled with quiet strength. And with that, the Apache warriors turned and rode off, leaving Luke and Eli standing together on the land that had become their shared home. The weeks that followed Luke's decision were filled with the quiet certainty of a man who had chosen his path. The Apache warriors, once a group he had only known from rumors and stories, had now become a part of his life. Their presence on his land was no longer just about protection. It was about something deeper, a shared understanding of what it meant to belong, to fight for what was right. Luke had come to see them not as outsiders, but as brothers, bound by a common cause. The settlers had retreated, for now, but Luke knew it was only a temporary victory. As much as the Apache were willing to stand by him, he knew the world outside was not ready to accept that kind of alliance. There were still those who would see the Apache as nothing more than a threat, and they would stop at nothing to erase them from the land. But for Luke, there was no turning back. He had made a choice, and it was a choice that defined who he was. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Luke sat outside, the soft hum of evening insects filling the air. Eli sat beside him, his usual quiet presence a comfort. The two men didn't speak much these days, but their bond had grown deeper than words. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Luke said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Eli didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the land, as if looking for something that wasn't there. "Yes," Eli replied after a long pause. "But it's not the end yet. It never is. This land, this life, has a way of testing you, of making you prove your worth." Luke nodded, understanding what Eli meant. The West was unforgiving, and it had always been a place where only the strong survived. But it was also a place where kindness and loyalty could mean everything. Eli turned to Luke, his expression serious but calm. "You've done more than prove yourself. You've given us something we thought was lost, something worth fighting for." Luke looked at him, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "And I'll keep fighting for it," Luke said, his voice steady. "For all of us." Eli's gaze softened, and for the first time, Luke saw a flicker of something like peace in his eyes. "Then we fight together. And together, we'll protect this land." The following days were filled with quiet preparation. The Apache warriors, though not actively fighting, kept a watchful eye on the surrounding land. They were always ready, always prepared for whatever might come. And as the weeks went by, the fear that had once gripped Luke's heart began to ease. The settlers didn't return, and the cavalry seemed content to stay away. It wasn't peace, but it was as close to peace as the land would allow. Luke continued to work the land, his bond with the Apache growing stronger with each passing day. He had come to respect their way of life, their deep connection to the land, their sense of honor, and their commitment to one another. It wasn't long before Luke began to understand that he was no longer just a man living on a piece of land. He was part of something much bigger, something that had the power to change the world. The bond between him and the Apache was unspoken, but it was strong. It was built on trust, on respect, and on the simple truth that they had each other's backs. Luke's ranch, once a solitary place on the edge of the world, had become a symbol of what could happen when different worlds collided, when people from opposite sides of history came together to fight for a common cause. And as the seasons changed, Luke knew that his life had been irrevocably altered. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face whatever challenges came his way. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a family now, one that was bound not by blood, but by loyalty and respect. And together, they would face whatever the world had in store. The land that Luke once thought was just his own had become a place of shared history, shared struggle, and shared hope. And as he looked out across the land, he knew that no matter what came next, they would stand together, Apache and rancher, side by side. Experience the thrilling world of Western stories with a captivating tale that blends courage, loyalty, and survival in the untamed frontier. This story takes you on a journey through the rugged wilderness, where a broke cowboy and a group of Apache warriors forge an unexpected bond in the face of danger. As settlers threaten their land, the cowboy must decide whether to fight for his new family or let them face their destiny alone. In true Western stories fashion, every twist and turn of the plot brings new challenges and moral choices that shape the future of those involved. With breathtaking moments of tension, action, and heart, this narrative explores the deep bond between different cultures, showcasing the resilience and honor that define the best of Western stories. As the cowboy stands side by side with the Apache, he discovers that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come from helping others, and the strength to protect what's right can change the course of history. This gripping tale of unity and resistance is just one of many extraordinary Western stories that highlight the power of mercy, bravery, and loyalty. Get ready to immerse yourself in a world where every decision matters, and every fight for justice leaves its mark on the land. The untold saga of the cowboy and the Apache tribe continues to unfold as they navigate the unpredictable challenges of the Western frontier, proving that together, they can face whatever the Wild West throws at them.